"Father, you're only getting $17.50. That was my son's final offer. You could hear the absolute smugness in his voice, knowing he was about to inherit his mother's $250 million tech empire. He practically demanded that I sit in the very front row at the reading of the will, just so he could watch his victory firsthand and see the look on my face when I was legally declared completely worthless. But what he didn't know was that my ex-wife, even from beyond the grave, had one final move left on the board, and I was the centerpiece of her entire plan. Before I tell you how this all unfolded, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you believe that the quietest person in the room is often the one playing the long game, make sure to like and subscribe. The roar of a pneumatic wrench is my symphony. For the past 10 years, that sound has been the background track of my life. Every harsh metallic scrape is a note, and every drop of motor oil on the concrete is a line of poetry. In this stifling, cramped garage just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, I'm not a disgraced aerospace engineer. I'm not a convicted federal felon or an exiled ex-husband. I'm just a mechanic, a guy trying to piece broken things back together with scrap parts. My hands, covered in calluses and a few permanent burn scars, understand the simple truth of machinery. Steel doesn't lie. Gears don't cheat. They just operate exactly as they are, rust and all. I respect that, so the smell of grease and rust remover became my only cologne. I was working on a 1969 Ford Mustang, Mach 1, watching the chassis suspension slowly return to perfect alignment under my hands. It was a peaceful way to live, just keeping to myself in the quiet. Then that peace was shattered. My old flip phone sitting on the cluttered workbench started vibrating, its harsh buzzing cutting right through the room. I shut off the air compressor, and the sudden silence was almost deafening. I wiped my hands on my dusty jeans, walked over, and looked at the screen. 2 words stared back at me, cold and unfamiliar. Connor Vance. 15 years. For 15 whole years, every single call from him had been a demand or an insult. No Christmas cards, no birthday wishes, just a massive, empty silence built out of blame and contempt. I figured that silence would last until one of us was in the ground. Turns out I was only half right. I took a deep breath of the gas-tinted air and flipped the phone open. My voice sounded raspy since I barely ever talked to anyone anymore. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was sharp and hurried, belonging to a world millions of miles away from my garage. It was the sound of Silicon Valley venture capital and obscenely expensive custom suits. "Arthur." He hasn't called me Dad in a very long time. To him, I was just Arthur. He said the name like it was a minor inconvenience, like a piece of lint on his expensive cashmere sweater. "Connor, your mother is gone." There was no sadness in his voice, no grief. He delivered the news like a news anchor reading a teleprompter. "Last week, a brain aneurysm. It was very fast." I froze, staring out the garage window at the barren yard baking under the New Mexico sun. A strange numbness washed over me. Eleanor was gone? The words didn't even seem to fit together. She had always been a force of nature, a hurricane of ambition, control, and ruthless calculation, brilliant, charismatic, and incredibly destructive. Hearing that she was gone felt completely unreal. He got impatient with my silence. "Did you hear me? The funeral is already over, and you weren't on the guest list. Now listen up, because this is why I'm calling. Her lawyers are requiring you to be present for the reading of the will. This Friday at 10 a.m. sharp, Sterling Allied Law Firm at the Embarcadero Center in San Francisco. Don't be late." This wasn't an invitation. It was a summons, a command issued by a newly crowned king, a son I had raised years ago who had long since exiled me. I finally found my voice, keeping it as steady as possible. "I don't have any reason to be there, Connor. 15 years ago at the federal courthouse in San Francisco, Eleanor and I settled everything. I don't own anything of hers, and she doesn't own anything of mine." There was a brief static hiss over the line, followed by a short, ugly laugh. It was a sound completely stripped of humor, pure, unadulterated mockery. And that sound triggered something deep inside me, deeper than any words could. "Oh, I know you aren't getting a dime," he scoffed. "Don't be stupid. My mother despised you, and all of Silicon Valley knows you're a criminal who stole trade secrets. But this is a legal formality, a procedural issue. You have to be there in person to officially hear the legal declaration that you are a zero, a documented, notarized statement confirming you mean absolutely nothing to this family." He paused, letting the venom sink in. "Personally, I just want to be there to watch your face. When those words are read out loud, I want to see that quiet, fake dignity of yours completely fall apart. That's the only entertainment value you can provide me right now." The humiliation was so direct, so completely raw, it was almost impressive. This wasn't the anger of a hurt son. It was the calculated cruelty of a winner who wanted to drag his opponent's face through the mud. "Are you done?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Almost," he said with a condescending chuckle. "Don't worry about the travel expenses. I'll throw you $17.50. That's enough for the cheapest Greyhound bus ticket back to your desert. Consider it a parting gift." And then the line went dead. I stood there with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. The silence of the garage rushed back in, but it felt different now. It was heavy, suffocating. The anger and old emotions I had buried under layers of grease and resignation for 15 years began to smolder. It wasn't a raging fire, but a hot coal buried deep under the ashes, slowly starting to glow red. He hadn't invited me to a will reading. He had summoned me to a public humiliation. My humiliation. He wanted a show. Fine. He was going to get one. I snapped the phone shut and set it down carefully. I walked over to the half-restored Mustang, running my hand along its cold, honest lines. Then I turned around, walked out of the garage, and stepped into the worn-out trailer next door. I went straight to the closet, looking past the flannel shirts and faded work pants that served as my daily uniform. In the very back, covered in a thin layer of dust, was a garment bag. I hadn't touched it in 15 years. I pulled it out and unzipped it. Inside hung my only suit, a dark charcoal worsted wool suit. It was the exact same suit I wore 15 years ago in federal court, the day I took a plea deal and my old life ended. I was going to wear it again, this time to witness the start of his new life. Friday morning, the Uber ride from San Francisco International Airport felt like traveling to another dimension. The sun-baked, quiet streets of Albuquerque were a distant memory, replaced by the steel and glass canyons of San Francisco's financial district, with a cold fog rolling between the skyscrapers. I paid the driver, and the fare hurt my wallet a lot more than I expected. I stepped onto the sidewalk. The air here was colder, sharper. The building housing the Sterling Allied law firm was exactly what you'd expect. It didn't just occupy the block, it dominated it. A vertical cliff of black glass and polished granite. I pushed through the revolving glass doors, and the noise of the city instantly cut out, replaced by a deep, solemn quiet. The lobby was a cathedral, built to worship wealth. The floors were vast sheets of marble, polished so bright I could see the distorted reflection of the high ceiling lights. The walls were paneled in smooth, dark walnut, faintly smelling of lemon oil and old money. I spent most of my life designing precise aerospace control systems, but I had never seen design so intentionally suffocating. This place wasn't built for human comfort. It was built to intimidate, to remind everyone who entered exactly how small they were. And I did feel small. I was wearing my one and only charcoal suit. The wool fabric was still high quality, the kind of texture that's hard to find these days. But the style was 15 years out of date. The cut was too loose, and the shoulder pads were too heavy. It was clean, though. I had ironed it myself back in Albuquerque, and the creases on the trousers were sharp as a blade. But the suit was old. It still carried a faint scent of mothballs, a mix of preservation and decay. As I walked toward the front desk, the soles of my old leather shoes made a lonely clicking sound against the marble. In that tomb-like silence, the sound was embarrassingly loud. A few young lawyers in their 30s, wearing custom suits that cost more than my pickup truck, looked up from their tablets. Their eyes didn't linger. They scanned me, categorized me, and dismissed me all in one smooth motion. I wasn't a client, I wasn't a threat, I was just old, an outsider. I felt like a smudge of grease on a blank white canvas, or an ink stain spreading across a legal document. I didn't belong here at all, and I knew that was exactly the point. This was Connor's first move, summoning me to his home turf, this fortress of power, making me wear the armor of my greatest failure. I reached the reception desk, which looked like a solid block of black marble carved straight out of a mountain. The woman behind it was young, impeccably made up, and wore a discreet earpiece that looked like an extension of her own body. "How can I help you?" Her voice was bright, but her eyes were bored. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock meeting," I said, my voice sounding rough, like unpolished metal parts grinding together. "The reading of Eleanor Vance's will. My name is Arthur Pendleton." Her eyes flickered, the name Vance registered, but my face didn't match the profile. She was undoubtedly expecting someone who looked like Connor, someone who belonged there, not me. A flash of confusion, followed by blatant condescension, crossed her face, before her professional mask quickly slid back into place. "Of course," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Mr. Sterling is expecting you. Please take a seat over there. Someone will be out to escort you shortly." She pointed toward a waiting area furnished with low-profile black leather couches surrounding a massive glass coffee table. I walked over and sat on the very edge of one. The leather felt cold and stiff. I clasped my hands together, resting my rough, mechanic's hands, stained with grease that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove, against the fabric of my old suit. I looked at the abstract, incredibly expensive art hanging on the walls. They meant absolutely nothing to me, just shapes and colors designed to fill space. I was a ghost, a relic of a past they had all agreed to bury. And there I sat, waiting to be legally declared worthless, exactly as my son had promised. The anger from that phone call, that smolder inside me, flared up a little brighter. I didn't come here to be humiliated. I came here to end this. They didn't just walk into the waiting room. They made an entrance. Connor wasn't alone. He moved with that unearned confidence, the distinct arrogance of a man who has never heard the word no in his entire life. He wore a minimalist, custom Brunello Cucinelli suit that probably cost more than I make in 6 months of fixing cars. It fit him perfectly, highlighting a physique maintained by personal trainers rather than hard labor. His hair was meticulously styled, and on his wrist, a Richard Mille watch caught the light with the cold gleam of carbon fiber and gold. His expression was one of pure bored superiority. Behind him followed his accessories. First was a slender, strikingly beautiful, but obviously heavily enhanced young woman. She was poured into a tight Balenciaga dress, gripping a Himalayan Birkin bag like it was a lifeline. I'd later find out her name was Lacey. She was completely glued to her phone, her thumb endlessly scrolling through the screen. The second was a man in his 40s, wearing a suit that was a bit too tight and sporting blindingly white, unnatural teeth. He had that shark-like, permanent, predatory smile you see all over Silicon Valley venture capital circles. This had to be Trent, Connor's chief investment advisor and resident yes-man. They weren't a family mourning a loss. They were a pack of predators circling what they assumed was a carcass. Connor strode up to the reception desk, never once looking in my direction. "Connor Vance," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Sterling is expecting me." The receptionist, who had barely given me the time of day, was suddenly all smiles and efficiency. "Right away, Mr. Vance. We'll get that sorted out immediately, Mr. Vance. Please have a seat for just a moment." As he turned around to claim one of the leather couches, his eyes finally landed on me. He stopped dead in his tracks. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a cat that had just cornered a mouse. He walked over, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the marble. Intrigued, his 2 followers trailed right behind him. "My God," he said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "You actually showed up." He scanned me up and down, his eyes lingering on my outdated suit and frayed collar. "I guess you really needed that $17.50, huh?" Lacey, the young woman, looked up from her phone for the first time. She let out a short, sharp giggle that sounded like breaking glass. Trent's shark-like grin widened. He looked at me, not as a human being, but as an obsolete piece of furniture, a piece of junk that needed to be hauled away. He didn't even bother to extend a hand. It was just a dismissive clinical assessment. Connor waved a hand vaguely in my direction, addressing his disciples. Everyone, this, he paused, and the hesitation itself was a calculated insult, is my father. He spat out the word father, like it was a dirty secret, an unfortunate biological fact he was forced to acknowledge. He was apologizing. He was apologizing for my existence, my cheap suit, my worn-out shoes, and my failure to be a proper reflection of his own greatness. My mind flashed back to Christmas morning when he was 12 years old. I had spent months in my workshop, back when I still owned a fully equipped garage, handcrafting a highly precise, miniature Stirling engine model for him. I was so incredibly proud of it. Connor opened the box, looked at it for a single second, and threw it aside. There's not even a brand name on this, and it's not even a smart device, he complained. I want the one all my friends have. And Eleanor, who always preferred solving problems with money, immediately pulled out a massive box, loaded with the latest Apple products and VR headsets. That was how she did it, fueling one spoiled whim after another, creating the monster standing before me. The man in front of me wasn't a man at all. He was just a collection of desires wrapped in a $20,000 suit. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. I met his smug, arrogant stare and didn't flinch. I didn't look away, and I didn't defend myself. My silence seemed to unnerve him far more than any angry retort would have. He was expecting a reaction, begging, pleading, anger, anything to validate his power over me. I gave him nothing. I just sat there, a ghost in a gray suit, watching the performance he was so desperately trying to put on. His smile tightened. He wasn't getting the satisfaction he had planned on. He turned to Trent. Anyway, the first thing we need to do is liquidate the Menlo Park real estate portfolio, cash out the capital streams over there. The sound of heavy oak doors opening cut him off. A man stood in the doorway, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The show was about to begin. As my son stood there, basked in his own aura of arrogance, my mind drifted further back into the past. That same Christmas when he was 12, the entire house smelled of pine needles and cinnamon. He had looked at my handmade engine for all of 3 seconds before tossing it to the floor. I want what my friends have. And my wife, Eleanor, didn't correct him. She didn't explain the value of a gift made with love. She just pacified him with a mountain of expensive electronics. It wasn't kindness. It was just easier for her. She built this monster brick by brick, buying his affection because earning it required too much effort. Even back then, I think she knew it. The memory was so vivid I could almost taste the bitterness of it, but it was cut short by the heavy oak doors swinging open. A man in his late 60s stood in the doorway. He was tall, wearing an impeccable charcoal suit that spoke of quiet authority rather than flashy wealth. This was Mr. Stirling. He had the unreadable, stoic face of a judge, and his eyes didn't just look at you. They evaluated you, weighed your worth, and filed you away. The quiet confidence he radiated instantly silenced the room. Even Connor seemed to shrink just a bit. His gaze swept across the area, brushing past Connor and his entourage as if they were nothing more than lobby furniture. Then his eyes locked onto me. For a brief moment our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of something in his expression. It wasn't pity. It was closer to an understanding. He walked directly toward me. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice steady and respectful, "thank you for coming." He didn't offer a handshake, but the words themselves carried the weight of one. It was a simple acknowledgement of my presence, a validation of my right to be there. Then and only then did he turn to my son. "Mr. Vance," he said. The greeting was the same, but the tone shifted, colder, strictly professional, stripped of any warmth. The slight was so subtle that someone less observant might have missed it, but Connor's entire world was built on the fragile scaffolding of status and special treatment. To have me, the outcast, acknowledged first was a direct challenge to his authority. I saw a flash of irritation in his eyes, and his jaw clenched. He tried to brush it off with dismissive arrogance. "Let's get this over with, Sterling," he snapped, his voice sharp with impatience. "I have a private room booked at the Four Seasons to celebrate. I don't intend to be late." Mr. Sterling's expression remained unchanged. He simply gave a firm nod. "As you wish," he said, turning to hold open the door to the conference room. "Gentlemen, right this way." The conference room was just as cold and imposing as the lobby outside, but it carried an added weight of finality. A massive table made of dark, polished mahogany dominated the center of the room. It was highly reflective, looking almost like a pool of black water. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined an entire wall, but they didn't offer a view of the sky. They only provided a cold, close-up look at the steel and concrete structure of the gray skyscraper across the street. This was a room designed specifically for signing life-altering contracts and quietly dismantling opponents. Connor naturally claimed the seat at the very far end of the table, a clear declaration that he was the new head of the family. He leaned back and spread his arms wide, staking his claim on the empire. Lacey and Trent sat on either side of him, looking like a queen and a bishop protecting their king. I found a seat near the door like an afterthought. I was just there to fill a chair and meet a legal requirement. I rested my calloused hands on the mahogany, creating a stark contrast against the flawless, polished wood. Mr. Sterling walked over to the head of the table. He didn't sit down right away. He placed a thick, leather-bound document on the surface with a soft but definitive thud. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. He deliberately pulled out his chair, sat down, and with methodical slowness, reached into his breast pocket to pull out a pair of simple, gold-rimmed reading glasses. He put them on with quiet precision. He was in complete control of the room. He opened the binder. The pages were thick and cream-colored. He cleared his throat. "This," he began, his voice easily filling the space, "is the last will and testament of Eleanor Vance, executed on August 4th of this year. I, Eleanor Vance." Even from the grave she was making a statement. She had taken back her maiden name after the divorce, the name she used to build her data, agriculture empire in Silicon Valley. Vance, a name that was a brand, a name that, according to my son, was worth $250 million. Mr. Sterling's voice remained flat, the perfect tool for delivering a legal document. "Being of sound mind and body, I hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils." Connor let out a long, impatient sigh and glanced at his expensive watch. He was already bored. "First," Mr. Sterling continued, "I direct that all my lawful debts and funeral expenses be paid from my estate." He paused and turned the first page. "Second, I leave the tax-free sum of $50,000 to my housekeeper, Maria Gonzalez, for her 15 years of loyal service and her endless patience." I saw Connor roll his eyes. He muttered something to Trent that I couldn't quite catch, but the shape of his mouth made the words "chump change" pretty obvious. However, I found myself smiling, just a tiny inward twitch of my lips. Maria. I remembered her. She had been with Eleanor since before the profits of the agricultural data company truly exploded. A kind, quiet Mexican woman. Every time Eleanor and I had a massive, explosive argument, Maria would always make sure there was a hot cup of coffee waiting for me in the kitchen. She saw right through everything. She deserved every single penny. It was a brief flash of the woman I used to know. Eleanor could be generous. She just chose her moments very carefully. "Third," Mr. Sterling read on without a tremor in his voice, "I leave the sum of $100,000 to the Central Valley Farm Workers Support Foundation." This time Lacey reacted. She let out a short, incredulous scoff. "Farm workers," she whispered to Connor, but loud enough for me to hear. "Is she serious? Didn't she spend millions hiring lawyers to fight them every day?" I felt a sharp pang in my chest. It wasn't grief. It was something far more complicated. Nostalgia. Long before Connor was born, before Ceres Tech became an empire, Eleanor and I used to drive a beat-up pickup truck out to the Central Valley. We slept in cheap motels, talking to farmers with dirt-stained hands under the blazing sun, testing our very first agricultural sensor models. I remembered her standing in those fields, watching the first prototype actually work, her face smudged with dirt and tears running down her cheeks. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Arthur," she had whispered. "We're going to change this land." Even after all the bitterness, all the lawyers, the betrayal, and the years of silence, she still remembered that day. This wasn't just a donation. It was a signal. Fourth, I leave the sum of $25,000 to my driver, Michael Rodriguez, for his excellent service and for his absolute silence regarding the incredibly flashy guests my son brought to my home. Connor snapped upright. "What on earth is that supposed to mean?" Trent placed a calming hand on his arm. "It's nothing, Connor. Just a petty jab. It doesn't mean anything." But Connor was visibly growing agitated. This wasn't going according to his script. He was supposed to be the absolute center of attention, but the opening acts were taking up way too much time. He started tapping his fingers against the mahogany table. A sharp, impatient click, click, click echoed in the quiet room. Ignoring him completely, Mr. Sterling continued. "Fifth, I leave my collection of first edition modernist poetry to the Stanford University Library." Click, click, click. "With the exception of one volume, a 1922 edition of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which I leave to—" Connor slammed his open palm onto the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "Sterling, for God's sake," he snarled. "Can we skip the charity donations and the tips for the help? My time is valuable. I have reservations. Get to the point. The real estate, the stock portfolios, the cash. Skip right to the part where everything goes to me." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Mr. Sterling stopped reading. He didn't look startled. He didn't look angry. He just stopped. Very slowly, he raised his head, his eyes steady behind his reading glasses. Then, with a deliberate calmness that was far more intimidating than any shout, he removed his glasses. He folded them. He set them down on the table. And then he locked his gaze onto my son. His eyes were flat, cold, and completely unimpressed. It was the look of a man who had dealt with spoiled children his entire career, and at this final moment he was completely done with it. "Mr. Vance," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping from its flat monotone into a precise, razor-sharp tool. "This is not a negotiation. This is not a business meeting. This is the legal reading of a deceased woman's final wishes. I'm going to read every single word on this document exactly as your mother wrote it in this room, and you are going to sit there, and you are going to listen. Am I making myself clear?" Connor's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He had been challenged. He had been scolded like a child. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Trent, who gave a subtle, urgent shake of his head. He was cornered. Mr. Sterling held his gaze for one more second. Then, satisfied, he put his glasses back on. He picked up the document. He smoothed the paper deliberately, took a slow sip of water from a glass beside him, and cleared his throat. He made my son wait for him. He re-established absolute control. "Very well," Mr. Sterling said, his voice returning to its neutral drone. "Let us continue. Fifth, as I was saying, I leave my first edition copy of The Wasteland to—" He paused, and I could swear I saw a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Ah, no. That line has been crossed out. Moving on. We now come to," he said, "Article 6, regarding the personal social circle of my son, Connor Vance." I noticed Trent, the venture capital advisor, sit up a little straighter. His shark-like grin returned to his face. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive suit, adjusting his posture to receive the reward he felt he earned for managing Connor's impending fortune. Beside him, Lacey finally put down her phone, her eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. Mr. Sterling read on. "To my son's financial advisor, Mr. Trent Davis." He pronounced the title with a slight, almost unnoticeable emphasis, as if putting it in quotation marks. "I leave the sum of $5,000. Trent's smile froze. 5,000. The number hung in the air, shockingly small. It was an insult. It wasn't even enough to cover half of one of his custom suits. I saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped the edge of the table. Connor looked at him with annoyance, as if Trent's disappointment was a personal offense to him. But Mr. Sterling wasn't done. I leave this sum with a legally binding recommendation that he use these funds to enroll in a course on business ethics and regulatory compliance. Financial due diligence performed by my own team suggests he is in desperate need of a refresher on the topics of fraud and insider trading. The shark-like smile vanished completely, replaced by a pale mask of shock and absolute fury. His head snapped toward Connor, his eyes wide. "What is the meaning of this?" he hissed, his voice vibrating with a low, angry tremor. He had just been explicitly called a fraud in a room full of people. Without missing a beat, Mr. Sterling turned his attention to the young woman beside Connor. "To my son's current companion, Miss Lacey, I leave the counterfeit Cartier bracelet that she attempted to swap with the authentic piece in my dressing room last month." If Trent was stunned, Lacey was completely incinerated. Her perfectly made-up face turned a mottled, dark red. Her mouth hung half open. She hadn't just been insulted, she had been exposed. Exposed as a cheap, petty thief in front of the man she was clearly trying to land, in front of the top lawyers in Silicon Valley, and in front of me, the ghost she hadn't even bothered to look at. This crazy old woman!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, all of her polished sophistication vanishing instantly. "She's lying. I never—" "Shut up!" Connor roared, his voice slamming against the mahogany walls. He wasn't protecting her. He was silencing an embarrassment. His carefully constructed image was crumbling. His inner circle was being dismantled piece by piece by the words of a dead woman. He wasn't angry that they were insulted. He was angry that this was taking so long. This was incredibly messy. This was not part of his victory celebration. "That doesn't matter," he yelled at the two of them. "It's nothing. It's just a petty prank. Who cares about a fake bracelet? Who cares about $5,000? He turned his furious glare back to the lawyer. "Keep reading, Sterling. Stop wasting time on this garbage and skip to the part that belongs to me." I sat there completely motionless. For the first time in 15 years, I felt a strange connection to Eleanor again. This was the woman I had married, not the flawless tech victim my son always pictured, but a brilliant, cold, and incredibly precise woman. She wasn't just having her will read. She was settling every single score. She was burning down every piece of Connor's social circle, isolating him, leaving him with absolutely nothing but his own greed. In her own way, she was clearing the table before serving the main course. Mr. Sterling, completely unfazed by the outburst, simply waited for the shouting to die down. He looked at Connor with an unreadable expression. "As I have already stated, Mr. Vance, I will read every word. Now, if I may continue." I sat there watching the fallout of Eleanor's words. Trent looked like he had swallowed poison, and Lacey was shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. I thought to myself, this is the Eleanor I remember. She never forgot a slight. She never let an insult go unanswered. She kept a perfect, detailed ledger in her mind of every wrong ever done to her. Even after death, speaking through a leather-bound document, she was as sharp as a surgeon's knife. She was still balancing her books. Mr. Sterling let the silence settle for a moment. Then he turned the page. The room grew tense. This was it. After clearing out the junk, the main event had arrived. "Article 7, Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping back into that neutral legal drone. "To my son, Connor Vance." Connor leaned forward. His breathing became shallow. His knuckles, pressed against the table, turned white from the strain. He had already forgotten about his humiliated companions. All of his focus, all of his greed, was now locked onto the lawyer, like a laser beam. "I give and bequeath the Silicon Valley estate located in Menlo Park." Connor let out a massive sigh of relief, a genuine full-body exhale. The color rushed back into his face. He smirked, throwing a triumphant look first at Trent and then at me. The estate, the crown jewel, it was his. Mr. Sterling continued, "along with my complete collection of vintage Swiss Patek Philippe timepieces." Connor's smirk widened into a full-blown grin. He let out a short, arrogant chuckle. Yes, now we're talking." He looked at me, his eyes gleaming. "Hear that, old man? Patek Philippe, all mine. Mr. Sterling raised a single finger, coldly cutting off Connor's celebration. However, he said, and the word hung in the air like a blade, the timepiece collection is secured inside a high-security vault on the estate property, and the only key to that vault. Mr. Sterling paused. He looked down at the document, then raised his head, his eyes traveling across the wide mahogany table to lock onto mine. Has been entrusted to his father, Arthur Pendleton. A dead silence followed. It was so completely quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Lacey and Trent, who had been stewing in their own humiliation just seconds ago, snapped their heads toward me. Connor just stared, his eyes wide. The color drained from his triumphant face, and his smile dissolved. What? His voice was small, filled with total disbelief. What did you just say? He raised his volume, barking at Sterling. That key, Mr. Vance, was entrusted to your father. Connor slammed his hands on the table and stood up so fast his chair screeched violently against the floor. What kind of nonsense is this? Is this a joke? A sick joke? He pointed a trembling finger at me. Him? He hasn't seen her in 15 years. He doesn't even know where she lives. He's a convicted felon. He's a nobody. Every eye in the room was fixed on me, and I was just as shocked as he was. I stared at Mr. Sterling, my mind a complete blur. A key. Eleanor had given me a key. What did that mean? Was this another one of her games? Another way to twist the knife, even from the grave? I didn't have a key. I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. I just sat there, the ghost in the gray suit, suddenly and very uncomfortably the center of everyone's attention. My son was screaming, his face a mask of disbelief and pure fury. But I wasn't in that cold mahogany room anymore. As Mr. Sterling turned the page, the heavy slide of the paper seemed to pull me backward, through 15 years of anger and silence, right back into a different crisis. I wasn't in San Francisco. I was back in our old house in San Jose. The year was 2011. It was 3 a.m, and the entire house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in Eleanor's study. I found her there, not crying, but worse. She was just sitting there, staring blankly at walls covered in supply chain data models, her face pale and entirely expressionless. She looked broken. Ceres Tech, the data agriculture company that was her life, her passion, her entire identity, was bleeding out. It was on the verge of a total collapse. Due to a fatal software defect in their new smart harvester arrays that caused massive crop failures, they were facing millions of dollars in breach of contract lawsuits. She had overextended, and worse, desperate for capital. She had bypassed compliance and trusted the wrong investors. The entire company's survival was built on a fabricated offshore account and a fake safety net. And now everything was exposed. The banks were calling in loans frantically, and investors were threatening to sue her into oblivion. She wasn't just facing bankruptcy, she was facing disgrace. I remember sitting next to her in that dark study, the computer screen casting a ghostly shadow over her face. "It's over, Arthur," she whispered, her voice completely hollow. "Everything I built, it's all gone. They're going to take the house. They're going to take everything." She wasn't just afraid of being poor. We had been poor when we first started the company. She was afraid of failure, afraid of being seen as a joke. Her entire world was built on her reputation as the brilliant, untouchable queen of Silicon Valley. And now that reputation was about to face a public execution. She looked at me, her eyes, usually so full of fire and ambition, now completely empty. "The FBI is involved," she said, her voice so faint it was barely audible. "They tracked the source of that offshore funding. It's a foreign shell company with military ties. They're talking about federal sanctions violations, money laundering, maybe even treason." I looked at this woman, my wife, the mother of my son, the brilliant, infuriating, passionate woman I had loved. In that moment, I knew she was drowning, and she was about to drag us all down with her. The memory of 2011 turned sharp and painful. Eleanor sat in her office, completely shattered. She didn't just look broken, she was broken. For a whole week, our house felt like a tomb. The phone rang nonstop, filled with angry bankers and betrayed investors. Eleanor just let them ring. She didn't eat, she didn't drink, she didn't sleep. She just sat in her office, staring at the financial data on her computer screen, watching the numbers turn into a sea of red. She was paralyzed. After about a week of this living nightmare, a hand reached out. It didn't come from a bank. It didn't come from a friend or a trusted colleague. It came from an encrypted email routed through a server in Dubai. It was an invitation to a meeting from a shadowy private equity group I had never heard of. They said they had been watching Series Tech for a while. They saw potential. Eleanor was too sick, too paranoid to even answer the phone. She had become a ghost. She begged me to go. I was still her husband, her partner in life, even if I wasn't the business brains. I was the chief systems engineer. I knew the code and the hardware architecture under her empire better than anyone. So I went. I met them in a cold, soulless conference room at a hotel near San Francisco International Airport. There were 3 of them. They weren't bankers. They were young, wearing identical, impeccable dark suits, and they had the cold, dead eyes of people who had seen too much. They were polite, too polite. It was the kind of politeness that felt more threatening than an open insult. They laid their terms out on the table. On the surface, it was a miracle. It was breathtakingly simple. They would immediately inject $50 million into Series Tech, enough to fill the holes, enough to pay off the angriest bankers, enough to quiet the lawsuits threatening criminal charges. It was a complete rescue. I sat there stunned. And in return? I asked cautiously. What do you want? The chief negotiator, a man with a thick Eastern European accent, pushed a thin black folder across the table. We are investors, Mr. Pendleton. We just want to invest in your sensor and drone mapping network technology. We believe in your system. I brought that folder home. It felt heavy, like it was made of lead. Eleanor, absolutely desperate for any sliver of hope, tore it open immediately. For the first 10 minutes, she was ecstatic. She was crying and laughing all at once, hugging the papers tightly against her chest. We're saved, Arthur. We're saved. But I was looking at the fine print. I'm an engineer. I've spent my entire life reading long, complex architecture diagrams and low-level code. And this wasn't a venture capital deal at all. It was a criminal blueprint. Eleanor! My calm voice cut right through her celebration. Look at this. Look at the open API access they're demanding. I pointed to the addendum, the exact section they hoped we'd never look too closely at, detailing the routing of the data streams they required. Look at these protocols. They make no sense. None of it does. The data completely bypasses our encryption layer. She didn't get it at first. She was completely blinded by the $50 million lifeline. So what? She said, waving her hand dismissively. As long as they pay. That's their data issue, not ours. No, I said, a cold dread creeping up my spine. That's their whole purpose. This isn't an investment, Eleanor. This is a military mapping network. The smile froze on her face. What are you talking about? They give us $50 million in clean capital right now, I explained in a flat voice. That saves the company. In exchange, we open a back door to our high-precision agricultural drone mapping network and weather sensors. They don't want farm data. They want high-definition terrain scans, radar parameters, and low-level imagery of strategic infrastructure. We'd be routing it directly to their servers in Cyprus. This isn't agtech. They're using your company, your name, as a cover for an espionage ring. I tapped the signature page. They aren't investing. They're stealing national security level data, and they want you to be the shield. The color drained from her face. It finally clicked. She had spent her entire life, poured every ounce of her soul, into building Series Tech, into a Silicon Valley darling, the future of agtech. And these people were about to turn her into a target for a federal treason investigation. No, she whispered, I won't sign it. Then we file for bankruptcy, I stated, laying out the simple, brutal truth. It's over. No, she screamed. The word tore from her throat. She jumped up, pacing her office like a cornered animal, pulling at her hair. No, I can't. You don't understand, Arthur. She grabbed the front of my shirt, her nails digging into my chest. If we go under, they will investigate. They'll do a forensic audit. They'll find the previous offshore funding gaps. They'll say I was laundering money all along. They'll hit me with federal fraud. Her eyes were wild with terror. That's better than the alternative, Eleanor, I pleaded. This is national security. It's a massive federal crime. I don't care, she shrieked. And then she just completely broke down. She didn't faint. She just collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug, all the strength draining instantly from her body. She wasn't the CEO anymore. She wasn't the empire builder. She was just a terrified, cornered woman. Arthur, she wept, her voice muffled by the carpet. Please, please, I can't go to prison. I can't. She looked up at me, her face streaked with smeared mascara and pure terror. It was a look I had never seen on her face before. Absolute bottomless desperation. I can't lose the company, she whispered hoarsely. I can't. It's who I am. It's everything. If I lose Ceres Tech, I'm nothing. I'm worthless. She grabbed my hand, her grip freezing cold. And Connor? She choked out. What about Connor? He's at Stanford. He's on top of the world. Do you want him to be the son of a federal inmate? The son of a bankrupt failure? He'll be humiliated. He'll hate me. He'll hate us. Please, Arthur, there has to be a way. Please. She was hysterical, and she was right. She was trapped. If she refused the deal, she was ruined and facing prison time for financial fraud. If she accepted it, she faced much worse for espionage. She had built her own prison. I stood there watching her fall apart. This brilliant, ambitious, impossible woman. The woman who had built an empire from nothing. The woman who was sometimes so blinded by her own drive that she didn't see the cliff until she was over the edge. I looked at the contract on the desk. I looked at the blueprints for the code back doors. I'm a systems engineer. I understand how the world works. I know how to rewrite protocols. I know how to spoof data streams. I know how to build digital firewalls and isolate core servers so the stain doesn't spread. I saw a path, the only path, a terrifying, incredibly dangerous one, a way to give them what they wanted, but keep her name, her signature, and her public profile completely clean. She begged again. Arthur, please, what do we do? I looked down at her, the woman I had loved, the mother of my son, and then I made a choice, the choice that would define the rest of my life, the choice that would save her company and completely destroy me. I bent down and pulled her up, holding her by the shoulders. Stop crying, I said. My voice was calm with the unsettling stillness of a man who had just accepted his fate. Stop crying. Go to your room. Go to sleep. She stared at me, her eyes wide and confused. What? You will have no part in this, I said, my voice firm. You won't sign these documents. You won't attend these meetings. You won't be on these emails. You focus on the product launch. You focus on saving the public face of the company. You do what you do best. A tiny, desperate spark of hope flickered in her tear-filled eyes. But the money, the contract... I turned away from her and walked to the desk. I picked up the heavy black folder. I looked at the page where the line was left blank for the president and CEO of Ceres Tech. Leave it to me, I said. I became a ghost. While Eleanor stepped back into the spotlight as the face of Ceres Tech, giving TED Talks and approving new hardware designs, I retreated into the shadows. I became the intermediary. I was the one flying to Zurich and Cyprus. I was the one sitting in sterile hotel rooms, negotiating data transmission protocols with men who didn't use last names. Back in California, using my root access as chief systems architect, I created a complex series of back-end vulnerabilities. I built a digital maze, an incredibly intricate firewall whose sole purpose was to ensure that any investigation would stop dead before ever reaching Eleanor. The $50 million hit the accounts. Ceres Tech was saved. The bankers were satisfied. The lawsuits vanished. Eleanor was hailed in financial papers as a genius who had weathered the storm. And then the second phase of the deal began, the data smuggling. I was the one who signed the hidden server leases. I was the one who authorized the commands routing low-level mapping data to anonymous IPs. I personally oversaw the spoofed data logs that proved we were only transmitting weather patterns and soil moisture readings, when in reality, federal-grade, high-definition terrain scans were flowing out of the country. I did a brilliant job. Terrifyingly brilliant. My engineer's brain, so used to building tight logical systems, proved just as capable of constructing a flawless illusion. For 2 years I lived a double life. By day, the respected chief engineer. By night, a high-stakes data smuggler. I saved her company. I saved her name. I kept her out of a federal penitentiary. But you don't divert that level of data for long without someone noticing. The FBI didn't go looking for Eleanor. They didn't even know she was involved. They came for me. They had been tracking the Eastern European ring for years. They saw the data flowing to the secret nodes I had built. They saw the altered server logs. They saw the spoofed security certificates bearing my digital signature, my security credentials. They didn't kick the door down. It was a very quiet arrest. 2 agents in dark suits were waiting for me in my office early one morning. 他们把一切都摊在桌面上. They had the packet tracing logs. They had surveillance photos of me at the meeting near SFO. They had me dead to rights. They offered me a deal. Tell us who you're working for, the lead agent said. Give us the organization. Give us the network in Cyprus. Give us the true beneficiary of this conspiracy. I looked at the file on the desk. My name was on every single page. Eleanor's name was nowhere to be found. I had done my job too perfectly. I had a choice. I could hand Eleanor over to them. I could tell them the whole story. How terrified she had been. How she had begged me. How I had done it all to save her and our son from ruin. They might have been lenient. They might have understood. Or I could take the fall myself. I thought about Eleanor, breaking down in absolute despair on the study floor. I thought about Connor at Stanford, with his whole life ahead of him, a future built on his mother's glittering tech empire, an empire that was now secretly operating as a criminal front. So I made my second choice, the one that sealed my fate. I don't know what you're talking about, I told them. I ran up some massive gambling debts. I needed money. I found some buyers on the dark web. There's no organization. It was just me. I was desperate for cash. I gave them a confession, but not the one they actually wanted. I pleaded guilty to corporate espionage, to stealing trade secrets for personal profit, and to falsifying business records. I played the part of a greedy, stupid engineer who got in over his head. To keep Eleanor safe from national security charges, I had to take total responsibility for the breach. So I did. I went to prison. Because it was a nonviolent offense, and Eleanor's company generously provided a high-priced legal defense team, I only served 2 years in a federal minimum security facility, but I lost absolutely everything. My security clearance was permanently revoked. My reputation was completely shot. My name was dragged through the mud all over Silicon Valley. Arthur Pendleton, the disgraced thief who sold out his own company for a quick buck. I became a pariah, and that was when my son, Connor, twisted the knife. He was 22 at the time, coming home from Stanford, and he saw his opportunity. He went to his mother, not to comfort her, but with an angle. "He betrayed you," Connor ranted to her, a performance I'd only find out about much later. "He used your company. He stole secrets behind your back. He's a criminal. He embarrassed you. He embarrassed me." He gave her a simple narrative, an easy way out. In his version, I wasn't the savior. I was the villain. And Eleanor, seeing her company saved, her name completely clear, and my reputation entirely destroyed, chose the easy path. She chose the story that made her the victim. She chose her son's version of the truth. She filed for divorce. She painted herself as the betrayed wife of a greedy criminal. She let Connor, our son, believe it. She let the entire world believe it. She never once stood up for me. She just watched me burn. That was the price of saving her. The memory was cut short, like a sharp chisel breaking through 15 years of silence. I blinked. The dark San Jose study vanished, replaced by the cold, polished mahogany of the conference room. My heart was pounding. The past felt more real than the present. I looked up. Mr. Sterling was watching me, his face still completely unreadable, but everyone else was staring. Trent's eyes flashed with greedy calculation. Lacey looked at me as if she were seeing me for the first time, a flicker of curiosity on her blank face. And Connor, my son, was glaring at me with terrifying intensity. His face looked like a brewing thunderstorm of doubt and fury, the veins on his neck bulging. "The key!" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "Where is it? What did she give you?" He was convinced this was a setup, a final parting shot from his mother, and that I was a willing accomplice. He saw collusion in every shadow. I looked from his furious face to Mr. Sterling's calm expression, searching for an answer, but there wasn't one. My mind was completely blank. For 15 years, my life had been about motor oil, scrap metal, and quiet isolation. Vault keys and vintage watches belonged to a life that wasn't mine anymore. I looked back at my son. In his mind, his $250 million inheritance was currently being blocked by me, the ghost he had summoned just for his own amusement. I shook my head, not in defiance, but out of genuine confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. It was the absolute truth. My response hung in the air as a simple, unadorned fact. Connor stared at me, his face a canvas of pure disbelief, before it hardened into contemptuous rage. He was processing this new variable. He looked like a bull temporarily stunned by a shock, but it only lasted a second. He let out a rough, barking laugh. It was a forced sound, a performance meant to show he was still in charge, as if this were all just a minor, ridiculous annoyance. "Whatever," he snapped, waving a hand dismissively as if brushing away a fly. "A key. You think I care about a key? You think I'm going to play some treasure hunt game with him?" He laughed again, louder this time. "I'll have a locksmith drill that vault open before lunch. It's completely meaningless. Just a petty sentimental game from a dying woman." He sat back down, but he wasn't relaxed. He was wound up far too tight. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Mr. Sterling. "Enough with the games," he said, emphasizing every single word. "Enough with the help, enough with the foundations, and enough with the keys. Get to the point, Sterling. The real assets. The $250 million. Read the part where everything comes to me. Now." Mr. Sterling looked at my son over the top of his reading glasses. He showed no fear, no irritation. He just let Connor's demand hang in the air, letting its sheer arrogance choke in the heavy silence. Then, with that same infuriatingly methodical calmness, he adjusted his glasses, took a slow sip of water, and turned the page. The heavy slide of the paper sounded like a clap of thunder in the tense room. It was the sound of a judge turning to the final page of a verdict. He was executing Eleanor's script exactly as intended. "Very well," Mr. Sterling said, his voice returning to that flat, neutral tone. "We now come to Article 8, the disposition of the residuary estate, comprising all remaining property, both real and personal, wherever situated." This was it. The air in the room felt so thick it was hard to breathe. Connor was leaning forward so far he was almost falling out of his chair, every muscle tight with absolute greed. Even Trent and Lacey, despite their recent public humiliation, watched with desperate attention. This moment would make their own small embarrassments completely worth it. Mr. Sterling read from the page. "Regarding all remaining liquid assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, and the controlling interest in Series Tech, LLC." He stopped. He paused deliberately, looking down at the page as if rereading a complex, unexpected clause. He was drawing out the moment. He was a master of the performance. "Come on," Connor hissed, his voice like a snake. "Hurry up!" Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. "I direct as follows. First, to my ex-husband, Arthur Pendleton." I snapped my head up. "Me? What was this?" A choked, strangled gasp came from Connor. He took a sharp breath, looking like he'd just been punched in the stomach. His face, pale with anticipation, went completely rigid. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated hatred, locking onto me like lasers. He stopped breathing. He was just waiting. He was a bomb, and the fuse had just been lit. I could see the muscles in his jaw clenching and unclenching, grinding his teeth. What on earth was she doing? Was this her final piece of cruelty? Leaving me some insultingly small amount, a few $1,000s, just to drag his face through the mud one last time before giving the rest to Connor. Mr. Sterling continued, his voice completely level, showing no sign of the dramatic storm he was unleashing. To my ex-husband, Arthur Pendleton, I leave and bequeath the sum of $17.50. $17.50. The words just hung there. It wasn't an insult. It was a public execution. It was a joke. A petty, cruel, and incredibly childish joke. But Mr. Sterling wasn't done. He read the final part of the clause, the part that twisted the knife and locked it into place. $17.50, to be paid in cash. This sum is intended to cover the cost of a bus ticket back to the desert from whence he came. A journey my son, Connor, will undoubtedly be happy to recommend to him. It started as a snort, a choked, disbelief-filled sound, and then Connor's dam of self-control didn't just break, it completely evaporated. A loud, roaring, donkey-like laugh burst from his chest. It wasn't the sound of humor. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was a deep, vicious joy that made the air in the cold room feel completely sickening. He leaped out of his chair, his entire body shaking from the force of his laughter. He pointed at me, his finger trembling, his face turning a dark, mottled crimson. Real tears of malicious joy actually started streaming down his cheeks. $17.50, he roared, the words bouncing off the walls. $17.50. He leaned over and slammed his hand onto the priceless mahogany table. Oh my God, $17.50! Trent, who had been sitting in shocked, humiliated silence, seemed to catch the new wave. He saw a path back into his master's good graces. A slow, sickening smile spread across his face. Incredible, Connor. Just incredible. Lacey chimed in, letting out a sharp, sycophantic giggle. $17.50 for a bus ticket. Oh, Connor, she was so hilarious, wasn't she? Connor howled, straightening up and wiping a tear from his eye. He was a performer, and he finally had his audience back. He looked at his two companions, his chest puffed out with victory. She always did have a dark sense of humor. Always. He had won. In his mind, the game was over. The insults he threw at my friends were just the appetizer, and the whole confusion about the key was nothing more than a meaningless little interlude. This was the real punchline. This was the exact moment he had been waiting for. He was officially declared the winner, publicly, legally, and financially. And me? I was legally declared absolutely nothing. Less than nothing, actually. A $17.50 punchline. His roaring laughter finally died down, settling into a low, self-satisfied chuckle. He adjusted the cuffs of his Brunello Cucinelli suit, a gesture that signaled he was back in absolute control. He was the king of the castle again. He turned his gaze back to me, every trace of humor vanishing from his face, replaced by a cold, reptilian satisfaction. A dark, arrogant smile played on his lips. Well, he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy, I guess this is where it ends for you. He walked around the table, moving like a predator circling a target, and stopped just a couple of feet away from me. He looked me up and down with a level of disgust that felt almost physical. It's all over, old man. You heard what she said. $17.50. He reached into the pocket of his $20,000 suit and pulled out a slim alligator skin wallet. He opened it slowly, making sure the movement was as dramatic and deliberate as possible. You know, he murmured, his tone dropping into a private, mocking whisper, $17.50 is a little too insulting, even for a place like this. He pulled out a crisp $20 bill and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the polished mahogany, coming to a stop right in front of my hand. Here, take a 20. Don't ever say I never gave you anything. He stared at me, daring me to react. He wanted me to scream, to cry, or to humiliate myself by reaching for the cash. I didn't move a muscle. I just sat there, looking at the $20 bill, and then looking up at his smug, victorious face. I waited. I didn't feel humiliated, and I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel sad. All I felt was a deep, intense sense of anticipation. Because I knew Eleanor, and more importantly, I was watching Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling hadn't moved. He sat at the head of the table, his face a perfect mask of professional neutrality, his hands resting quietly on the documents. He was letting the performance play out. This wasn't the end. This was just the intermission. My complete stillness, my total lack of a reaction, irritated Connor far more than an angry outburst would have. His triumphant smile began to slip. "What's the matter, old man?" he sneered. "Cat got your tongue?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "Whatever. It's over. It's all mine. You can finally get the hell out of here. Go back to your broken garage or whatever hole you crawled out of. Just don't forget your bus fare." He turned his back to me, a final, complete dismissal. He walked back to his chair and clapped Trent heavily on the shoulder. "All right, Trent, let's head over to the Four Seasons. We've got a lot of champagne to open." He grabbed his suit jacket, ready to leave and start his new life. Halfway into his sleeves, he was all smiles again, slapping Trent's back so hard it looked like a punch. "That's right," he said loudly. "The Four Seasons. I'm buying out the entire wine list. Sterling," he called out over his shoulder, not even bothering to look at the lawyer, "have your receptionist send the final paperwork to my office for my signature. I'm done here." He turned toward the door, walking like a king leaving his own coronation. "Mr. Vance," the voice cut through the air like a blade slicing through thin ice. It wasn't loud, but it possessed an absolute core of steel. It stopped everyone instantly. It froze Connor right where he stood, his jacket half on, one foot already pointed toward the exit. He turned around, the triumphant smile on his face slowly hardening into confusion. "What?" Mr. Sterling remained seated. He hadn't moved an inch. He looked up at Connor, and his expression was no longer neutral. It was ice cold. "Please take your seat." The smile on Connor's face didn't just fade, it was completely wiped away. The color drained from his skin, leaving the red patches from his laughter looking like burns. "What did you say?" he muttered, his voice suddenly incredibly tight. "I said," Mr. Sterling repeated, his voice dangerously quiet, "sit down. I haven't finished reading." "Not finished?" Connor's voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" "You finished. 1750. The joke. It's over. You're done." Mr. Sterling, with the slow, deliberate motion of a man revealing a winning card, reached into his briefcase. He didn't touch the thick, leather-bound will that was already sitting on the table. Instead, he pulled out a second, much thinner folder. It was a standard manila envelope, but it was secured with a thick, heavy red wax seal. It looked incredibly official. "That," Mr. Sterling said, tapping the large leather binder on the table, "was the conclusion of the original last will and testament." Then he placed the new folder squarely on the mahogany. "This," his voice dropped an octave, "is a codicil, a legally binding amendment." He looked straight into Connor's eyes without blinking. "It was signed, witnessed, and notarized exactly 3 weeks ago, 1 week before your mother's aneurysm." He paused, letting the immense weight of those words sink into the room. "And its primary clause," he said, his eyes briefly flicking toward me for a fraction of a second, "explicitly states that it supersedes and replaces all previous clauses regarding the disposition of the residuary estate." Connor didn't just sit down, he practically collapsed back into his chair, his body dropping like a puppet with its strings cut. His face turned a waxy, shocking pale. The triumphant flush was entirely gone, and he suddenly looked incredibly small. Trent and Lacey froze completely. They stared at the new document with the red seal as if it were a live explosive. Mr. Sterling sliced open the wax seal using a small, sharp paper knife. He unfolded a single page, which was attached to several thicker documents. He slid his reading glasses back onto his nose. "This," he said, his voice stripping away any remaining neutrality, "is a letter written to you, Connor, from your mother. However, it comes with strict legal instructions that it must be read aloud in this room today, in front of all concerned parties. Its contents form the legal basis of the new Article 8. He began to read, and it was no longer just a lawyer's voice. The words were pure, unfiltered Eleanor. "To my son, Connor," Mr. Sterling read. He paused, then continued. "I'm writing this because I am finally tired of being a coward. For 15 years, I let you believe a lie I fabricated, a lie I protected, and a lie I allowed to destroy a good man. That good man is your father." "What?" Connor whispered. The sound was dry and raspy. "The story you grew up hearing," Mr. Sterling read on, "about your criminal, deceitful father betraying me and stealing secrets from the company, was completely made up. It was the exact opposite of the truth. No! Connor's voice erupted into a strangled shriek. He lunged halfway across the table, his eyes wide and wild. She was sick. She had dementia. That wasn't her. This is fake. He pointed a trembling finger at me. He controlled her. He manipulated her. This is a scam. He turned frantically to his advisor, Trent, his eyes pleading for help. Trent, tell him this won't hold up in court. She lacked the capacity. We'll contest it. We'll tear this thing to shreds. Mr. Sterling looked thoroughly bored by the outburst. He calmly raised a single hand to cut off the tirade, then slowly lifted another document from the sealed folder. On that note, Mr. Sterling said, his voice cutting cleanly through Connor's panic, attached to this codicil is a 40-page psychiatric and cognitive evaluation of your mother. It was conducted by a panel of 3 independent, board-certified neurologists and psychiatrists from Stanford Medical Center. This evaluation was requested by her voluntarily, exactly 72 hours before this document was signed. Let me summarize their findings for you. He locked his eyes onto Connor, his gaze like ice. In their professional, unanimous, and legally binding opinion, your mother, he read, was completely lucid, in full command of her mental faculties, and possessed a sharp intellect that actually exceeded 99% of her peer group. He dropped the medical report onto the table with a heavy, definitive thud. Your mother was not out of her mind, Mr. Vance. As she states here, she was just finally done. Now, if I may continue. Connor slumped back into his seat, his mouth slightly open, making a faint swallowing sound. He was completely out of moves. He looked like he was suffocating. Mr. Sterling returned to Eleanor's letter, his voice once again becoming the vehicle for her confession. The truth, Connor, is this. 15 years ago, Ceres Tech was on the verge of a total, catastrophic collapse. I made a series of terrible, reckless decisions. I overextended, and I trusted the wrong people. I was facing not just bankruptcy, but serious criminal charges for federal sanctions violations and money laundering. I was about to lose everything, the house, the company, my name. I was heading straight to federal prison. I closed my eyes tightly. I was right back in that dark San Jose study. I could hear her crying on the floor, pleading for a way out. The cold weight of that ancient night pressed down on me all over again. We had only one way out, Mr. Sterling continued to read. A deal with a group of foreign investors who had an incredibly dangerous background. This deal would save the company, but it required us to smuggle low-level, national security-grade data to them through our core systems. I was trapped. If I refused, I went to prison for fraud. If I accepted, I would eventually face consequences for espionage. I was a coward. I broke down, and I was ready to let the whole world burn. And that was when your father stepped in. I heard a tiny choked sound from my left. It was Connor. He was shaking his head, pressing his hands over his ears as if he could somehow physically block out the words. Your father, Mr. Sterling read, his voice relentless. The man you spent 15 years calling a criminal made a choice to protect me and to protect you. He took the fall. He put his name, his career, and his security clearance on the line. He forged the server logs. He took the meetings. He handled the data routing. He did all of the dirty work so that my name, the Vance name, would stay completely clean. The lawyer's voice showed no mercy. He took all the risk onto his own shoulders. He built a legal firewall around me and the company, and then he stood in the fire himself. When the FBI finally knocked on the door, they found him, exactly as he had planned. He took a plea deal, Connor. He confessed to crimes he didn't commit, corporate espionage, fraud, all to mask the real offense that I was responsible for, national security violations. He lost his license. He lost his reputation. He lost his entire career. He did it to save me and to save the company you now so arrogantly claim as yours. And what did I do? Mr. Sterling read, his tone dropping into a lower register. What was my reward for his sacrifice? I listened to you. I listened to your venom. You told me he was a criminal. You told me he embarrassed us. And I, in my shame and my cowardice, I agreed. I let that become the official story. I divorced him. I abandoned him. I let you, our son, treat him like garbage because I was terrified and that if you knew the truth, you would look at me with that same disgust. I was a coward, Connor, and I let you become a monster. A greedy, arrogant, empty man mocking the person who sacrificed everything so you could have this life. This $250 million fortune you're so desperate to claim? It exists for one reason and one reason only. It exists because your father, Arthur Pendleton, saved it. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum, heavy and suffocating. The sound of Mr. Sterling delivering Eleanor's final words was the only thing left. He was no longer just a lawyer. He was a vessel for a confession that was rewriting 15 years of history in real time. Connor was completely frozen. He wasn't shaking his head anymore. He wasn't covering his ears. He just stared at the smooth, empty surface of the table, his face a waxy mask of shock. He looked like a man who had just been told the world had ended, and he was the only one who didn't know. Mr. Sterling kept reading, his voice steady and completely unyielding. Your father, the letter continued, is not a criminal. He is not a failure. He is a hero. The kind of man who makes a sacrifice so deep, so absolute, that people like you and me cannot even comprehend it. He burned his own life to ashes just to keep us warm. And I let you treat him like dirt. I encouraged it. I used your contempt for him as a shield to hide my own shame. Every time you mocked him, every time you called him a washed-up criminal, it was another brick in the wall I built to protect myself from the truth. And the truth is, I was the weak one. I was the failure. I was the one who betrayed this family. My hands were shaking. I clamped them together tightly on top of the table, my knuckles turning white. I could feel a hot, stinging sensation behind my eyes, something I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't sadness. It was vindication. A brutal, painful vindication that was 15 years too late. Mr. Sterling's voice pushed forward, each word hitting like a sledgehammer, shattering the entire foundation of my son's life. This fortune, he read, this Silicon Valley empire you've been waiting to inherit like a spoiled prince, it doesn't exist because of you. It doesn't even exist because of me. It exists entirely because of Arthur Pendleton. And you, Connor, Eleanor's words were a direct, brutal assault now. You have never truly worked a day in your life. You have never built anything. You have never sacrificed anything. You are a parasite, a creature driven entirely by vanity. You have done nothing but spend money you didn't earn, all while looking down on the man who actually earned it for you. You are a consumer, living off the crumbs of his dignity. The words hit home. I watched the exact moment they broke him. Connor let out a sound, a tiny, fractured, animalistic whimper from deep inside his chest. No, he whispered to the table. No, she didn't. She loved me. She would understand. The arrogance was gone. The anger was gone. He was completely hollowed out. The entire narrative of his life, his brilliant, infallible mother, his criminal, incompetent father, his own status as the rightful heir, was thoroughly incinerated in a matter of 5 minutes. He slumped back into his chair, slowly and mechanically. His $20,000 suit, his armor of arrogance, suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. He looked like a child, a lost, broken, terrified child. No, he whispered again, his voice cracking. This is a lie. She wouldn't. Mr. Sterling looked up from the paper, his gaze stone cold. She did, Mr. Vance, and she had it all notarized. He turned the page. Now for the conclusion. The room wasn't just a conference room anymore. It was a courtroom, a confessional, a tomb, and now it was the stage for the final act. Connor sat slumped in his expensive suit, an empty shell staring at the table, though I knew he wasn't seeing the polished wood. He was looking at 15 years of his life exposed as a complete lie under the harsh fluorescent lights. Trent and Lacey were frozen, their own petty ambitions entirely irrelevant now. They were just collateral damage in a war they didn't even know was being fought. Mr. Sterling's voice, which had carried the weight of Eleanor's confession, shifted. It became firmer, more official. This was the verdict. the final legally binding words. He turned to the last page of the codicil. Your mother's letter, he said, looking directly at Connor, serves as the legal and moral preface to the following clause, the final binding term of her last will and testament. It supersedes all previous articles. This is the new Article 8, the final disposition. He cleared his throat and began to read. Therefore, he read, delivering Eleanor's final words, having stated the unvarnished truth, and in an attempt to remedy, in whatever small way financial means allow, a betrayal that can never truly be undone. He paused, sweeping his eyes across the room to ensure he had the absolute, undivided attention of every soul present. He did. The silence was so deep I could hear the tiny mechanical ticking of the clock on the wall. I hereby direct, as my final wish and binding testament, he continued, his voice steady, that all my real and personal property, wherever situated, all my stocks, bonds, and liquid assets, my art collection, my private holdings, and most importantly, my 100% unencumbered controlling interest in Ceres Tech, LLC, and all its subsidiaries, an estate and empire currently valued at $250 million. He read off the inventory of assets like a judge reading a death warrant. It wasn't a prize. It was a weight, an empire, an impossible burden. Connor didn't move. He wasn't breathing. He had become a statue, his skin a dull, ash-gray color. All of this, Mr. Sterling read, I give, devise, and bequeath. He stopped. He looked up, but he didn't look at Connor. He didn't look at Trent or Lacey. His eyes, clear and steady behind his glasses, traveled across the long, polished table. They found me. He locked his gaze onto mine. In that second of silence, my entire life seemed to hang in the balance. My garage, the smell of motor oil, my quiet, lonely peace. I wasn't thinking about the money. I wasn't thinking about victory. I was thinking, what did you do, Eleanor? What is this final, terrifyingly complex game? I was still reeling from the confession, shocked by the vindication that had been stolen from me for 2 decades. The money, the empire, it was a variable I couldn't even process. It was a different language. Mr. Sterling looked back down at the page. I give, devise, and bequeath to my ex-husband, Arthur Pendleton. The words didn't just fall. They hung in the air. Arthur Pendleton, me, the man in the 15-year-old suit, the man summoned here for a public execution. I heard a sound, a tiny, wet, gasping intake of air. It was Connor, but I couldn't look at him. I couldn't move. It felt as if the roof of the building had been torn off, and the crushing weight of the entire San Francisco sky was resting squarely on my shoulders. $250 million. Ceres Tech. This wasn't a gift. It was a life sentence. It was a chain. This was her way of pulling me out of my quiet obscurity and dragging me right back into the world of glass, steel, contracts, and lies that I had escaped. I could feel my heart beating heavy and slow in my chest. Thud, thud, thud. Mr. Sterling, bless him, didn't let the moment stagnate. He didn't wait for anyone to react. He knew the words that followed were the ones that truly mattered. He knew the money was just a tool. The reason was the real weapon. He kept reading, his steady voice cutting through the stunned, dead silence of the room. I leave this, he read, not as a gift, but as payment. A long overdue and completely inadequate compensation for a career I allowed to be ruined, a reputation I allowed to be stolen, and a family I allowed to be shattered out of my own cowardice. And in that exact moment, it finally clicked. It was never about the money. It was never about the money at all. It was about the record. This was her final, written, legally binding confession. This was her apology. This was her reaching out from the grave to give me back my name and to give me back my honor. She wasn't just handing me a company. She was telling the world that it belonged to me all along, that I was the one who saved it. I looked down at my hands, my calloused, oil-stained mechanic's hands. They rested on the flawlessly polished wood, a pair of hands used to fixing broken things, now holding an empire I never wanted. Across the table, a whimper escaped. It was Connor. He wasn't a monster anymore. He wasn't a king. He was just a boy. A 35-year-old boy whose entire life had just been exposed as a complete fiction. A lie told by his mother and paid for by his father. Trent and Lacey were already ghosts. Their faces were entirely blank, their minds completely unable to process this reality. They had hitched their wagons to a falling star, and now they were utterly irrelevant. I could see the panic in Trent's eyes, his rat-like mind spinning furiously, trying to find a new angle, a new scam, only to come up with absolutely nothing. Lacey was just pale, the mask of her heavy makeup looking like a porcelain shell that was starting to crack. Mr. Sterling, the executor of this devastating will, wasn't finished. He still held the codicil in his hands. There was one final matter to attend to. "Finally," Mr. Sterling said, his voice as unyielding as a judge's gavel, "we come to the ultimate bequest." He looked over at my son. As for my son, Connor Vance, hearing his name, a pathetic flicker of something sparked in Connor's dead eyes. It wasn't hope. It was something more primitive, an animal instinct desperate not to be left with absolutely nothing. Slowly, painfully, he raised his head, his bloodshot, hollow eyes locking onto Sterling. What was he expecting? $1 million? A trust fund? A small stipend? Some remaining scrap from the feast he believed was rightfully his? Mr. Sterling looked at him. There was no pity in his gaze, no emotion at all, just the cold execution of his duty. "As for my son Connor," he read, "who has already spent a lifetime drawing from a wealth he never earned, not just in the millions squandered, but in the unacknowledged sacrifices of others, I leave only one thing." Mr. Sterling paused. He looked down at the document, then back at Connor. "I leave him the exact amount he so thoughtfully and so publicly offered to his own father." I felt my breath catch. No. Connor's confused, broken gaze turned to me, then back to Sterling. He didn't understand. He couldn't make the connection. His mind was too shattered. I don't," he stammered. "What?" Mr. Sterling didn't answer. Instead, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached to the side of his desk. He opened a drawer. His hand went in and pulled something out. A voucher. A bank-certified voucher for cash. "As the representative of the estate," Mr. Sterling said, "I was authorized to prepare this in accordance with your mother's wishes." He held it up for a brief moment. Then he placed it on the polished mahogany. He slid it across the vast table. It made a faint rustling sound against the wood, coming to a dead stop right in front of Connor. $17.50, Sterling said, his voice completely flat. "The final figure. That is your inheritance, Mr. Vance. The exact amount designated by your mother for a bus ticket." Trent, the venture capital shark, said absolutely nothing. He didn't make a sound. He just stood up quietly and smoothly, pushing his chair back. He didn't look at Connor. He didn't look at me. He simply evaporated. He picked up his briefcase and walked swiftly, silently, out of the conference room. He was gone. Lacey, on the other hand, did not stay silent. She looked at the voucher. She looked at Connor's broken, pathetic face, and her shocked expression hardened into pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the absolute revulsion of a predator looking at a mate that had suddenly become weak. The man she had hitched herself to, the source of her Birkin bags and her Silicon Valley lifestyle, was nothing. He was a $17.50 man. "You," she hissed, her voice low and dripping with venom, "you are pathetic." She stood up, grabbed her own very real, very expensive handbag, and walked out of the room without looking back. The sharp click, click, click of her heels against the marble floor was the only sound left. Then there were three of us. The voucher. That $17.50 voucher lay on the polished wood, a final, brutal monument to my son's arrogance. Connor stared at it. His rapid, shallow breathing stopped completely. For 5 full seconds he didn't move. He was a statue of a ruin. I could see a tiny muscle in his cheek twitching, the only sign of life. And then he erupted. It wasn't a word. It was a scream, a primal, guttural roar of pure, undiluted rage that felt like a physical blow to the room. It was the sound of a man who had not only lost everything, but who realized in one horrifying second that he was nothing. "No!" His arms flew out, sweeping across the table. Glasses, legal pads, a heavy water pitcher, everything went flying. The crystal shattered violently against the mahogany walls. "I'm going to sue you!" he shrieked, his voice breaking, spit flying from his lips. He wasn't talking to Sterling. He was screaming at the universe, at his dead mother. "I'm going to sue all of you. She was crazy. She had dementia. I'll prove it. I'll burn this entire place to the ground." He spun around, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his eyes wild and bloodshot, and then his gaze landed on me. All of his fury, all of his humiliation, all of his pain focused into a burning laser of hatred, directed right at my chest. "You!" he roared. "It was you! You did this! You controlled her! You manipulated her! You thief!" Before the word even fully left his mouth, he lunged. He didn't walk. He launched himself across the room like a missile, his chair crashing heavily onto the floor behind him. He wasn't a Silicon Valley elite anymore. He was just a wild animal, blinded by rage, his hands clawing through the air straight for my throat. I didn't even have time to stand. My instincts could only brace for the impact, but Mr. Sterling was faster. His hand, which had been resting calmly on the table, moved with lightning speed to hit a small black intercom button on his desk, just once. Before Connor was even halfway around the massive table, the heavy oak doors were thrown open. 2 security guards filled the entrance. These weren't mall cops. These were men built like brick walls, former military operators in dark suits with earpieces, the kind of professionals hired to protect billionaires and diplomats. Connor, completely blinded by his own fury, didn't even see them until they grabbed him. One guard pinned his left arm, the other his right. They spun him around, his $20,000 jacket tearing at the seams as they forced his arms behind his back with brutal, practiced efficiency. "Get your hands off me!" he screamed, his voice a pathetic mix of rage and panic. He thrashed against their grip, but it was like a fly fighting against steel. Mr. Sterling stood up slowly. He looked at the chaos in the room, at the broken glass, and at the man sobbing and screaming in the grip of security. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Get him out," he said, his tone flat and icy. "You can't do this to me," Connor shrieked as they began to drag him backward out of the room. "I'm Connor Vance. I own this building. I'll have your jobs. And Mr. Vance," Mr. Sterling added, his voice cutting through the hysteria. Connor froze, his head snapping back, his eyes still wild. Mr. Sterling pointed to the white voucher still sitting innocently on the table. "Don't forget your inheritance." That completely broke him. The last remaining fragment of his sanity snapped. He started cursing. He cursed Sterling, he cursed his mother, but most of all, he cursed me. "I'll destroy you, old man. You hear me? I'll destroy you." His screams echoed down the hallway as they dragged him toward the elevators, his expensive leather shoes scuffing pathetically against the marble. The heavy oak door clicked shut. The silence that rushed back in to fill the vacuum of Connor's rage was profound. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the distant, muffled sound of a siren far below in the city. The adrenaline that had kept me upright, the shock of the past hour, all drained away in an instant. I felt exhausted, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that felt like 15 years of isolation hitting me all at once. I sank back into my chair, my old wool suit suddenly feeling as heavy as armor. It was just the two of us now, me, the man who now owned everything, and Mr. Sterling, the man who had delivered the verdict. I looked around the wrecked room, the overturned chairs, the shattered crystal, and the $20 bill Connor had thrown at me, still lying right next to that $17.50 voucher. I looked up at Sterling. He was calmly straightening his files, his face returned to that perfect professional mask, as if a Category 5 hurricane hadn't just ripped through his office. There was only one question left, the one remaining riddle. "The key," I said, my voice sounding raspy. "The watches. Why did she do that? Why involve me? In that part, it felt so cruel." Mr. Sterling stopped sorting his papers. He looked up at me, and for the first time that day, a genuine human smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a small, sad, knowing smile. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice softening, "that was your ex-wife's final test for her son. A test? And he failed it spectacularly. She wanted to see if, even for a second, he would be willing to humble himself and ask you for something, to see if there was any salvageable part of him left. He shook his head. Beyond that, it was a message for you. He reached into his breast pocket, the same pocket where he had kept his reading glasses. He pulled out a small object. It wasn't a thick leather binder or a sealed codicil. It was a key, an old brass-colored Ford pickup truck key. He slid it across the table. It made a sharp, metallic clink as it came to a stop right next to my hand. That, he said, is the key she actually left for you. There are no watches. That part was just a performance, a way to set the stage. Connor will hire people to drill into that vault at the estate, but he will only find empty velvet boxes. Her final prank, I suppose. The real assets aren't here. So what is it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What does this key actually open? Mr. Sterling leaned forward. It's a hidden RV lot out in the Nevada desert. This key opens the door to an old Airstream trailer. Inside, locked away, is a physically isolated data server. He paused, letting his next words carry their full weight. Inside, he said, is the raw evidence. Everything. The complete unedited file from 2011, all the illegal offshore routing logs, every forged certificate you were forced to sign, and most importantly, every single encrypted email she sent you, begging you to take the fall. My heart stopped. She kept it all, Mr. Sterling said quietly. She locked the absolute, unvarnished truth away for 15 years. The confession letter she wrote, everything is backed up by the data on that server. She wanted you to be the one to find it. She wanted you to be the one to decide whether to show it to the world. The money? He nodded toward the luxury surrounding us. That was her apology. But this, he pointed to the Ford key, is her giving your name back to you. I reached out, my rough, calloused fingers closing tightly around the cold brass. The $250 million, that was a heavy burden. It was a weight, a new kind of prison. But this key? This was freedom. This whole journey taught me a profound lesson. The truth has its own weight and its own patience. For 15 years, a lie poisoned an entire family, turning a son against the very father who had quietly saved him. But a lie built on silence and shame can never last forever. Eleanor's final confession proved to me that no matter how deeply it gets buried, the truth will eventually claw its way out of the dirt and find the light. It proved that true honor doesn't live in a public reputation, but in the quiet, unrecognized sacrifices you make when nobody is watching. In the end, a clean name is a far greater legacy than any fortune could ever be. If you were in my shoes, what would you do with this key and the heavy weight of that $250 million empire? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.